This week on Forward.
You want to know why nonprofits haven't changed the world the way we hoped that they would? Because that is not what we asked them to do. We asked them emphatically and consistently, and we still do, keep your overhead and your salaries low. So that's what they did. And if you keep your overhead and your salaries low, we will reward you with donations, regardless of the fact that you may not be having any impact in the world. And impact becomes an entirely secondary thing.
It's my pleasure to welcome to the podcast a hero of mine, entrepreneur, author, activist, nonprofit leader. You might know him from his world-famous TED Talks, plural, Dan Pallotta. Welcome, Dan.
Thanks for having me, Andrew. It's good to be with you.
So I left out movie star. You are the star of a new documentary that I thought was brilliant. And as we're having this conversation, it may be on streamers right now, Uncharitable. Tell me a little bit. By the way, I watched the movie and I thought it was awesome. But how the heck did this movie come about? And let's go a little bit further just so people who don't know you. I feel like everyone should know who you are. If you don't know who Dan Pallotta is, literally Google right now, Dan Pallotta TED Talk. It'll be the best 15 minutes you spend for quite some time. But somehow that TED Talk evolved into a full-fledged documentary feature.
Yeah, it started with a book I wrote for Tufts University Press in 2009 called Uncharitable, after I had created the AIDS Rides and the Breast Cancer 3 Days, and we raised almost $600 million in 9 years, and were the subject of a Harvard Business School case study. But during the journey of that success, we were pretty regularly, mercilessly crucified for having high overhead and paying people good salaries. And, I was sort of cataloging all of these dysfunctional ways our culture thinks about charity while we were building that company and while it was succeeding, and knew that I wanted to write a book about it. We went out of business suddenly in 2002 because of those issues, and then I wrote the book, and I knew when I wrote the book that it would be good subject matter for a documentary. It was I was going to TED. I went to TED in 2005 and 6 and 7, and saw Al Gore give his TED Talk, and then watched as that became a movie. And I thought the issues we cover in this book would be great for a documentary. It just took a long time to raise the money for it, and for it to be sort of, as Victor Hugo would have said, an idea whose time has come in terms of making it into a documentary.
Documentaries are tough sledding. I have been parts of documentaries. And so this documentary fleshes out the argument you made in your TED Talk. And I thought the TED Talk was very compelling and correct, in part because in a past life, I started and ran a nonprofit. So I have some jokes around starting nonprofits, that nonprofits run on two things: passion and money.
Yeah.
And one of the dark truths of being a nonprofit founder is that the way to get the money is to talk about the passion. But then even as you're talking about the passion, you're thinking, okay, how do I get the money?
Right. Yeah. And if you think about it, a lot of times people in the nonprofit sector will say, we have to beg for money. Well, guess what? Entrepreneurs have to beg for money too. It's not just the nonprofit sector where you're begging for money. It's in the nonprofit sector. People have miniaturized ambitions, as Susan Beresford at the Ford Foundation used to say, about how much money they're entitled to. Like the nonprofit sector doesn't distinguish the concept of capital. Nonprofits think of their capital as whatever's in their petty cash. So if they get $23,000 in their petty cash, that's the money they can use to create something new, whether that's a new fundraising endeavor or a new program. Well, that's not how entrepreneurs in the for-profit sector think about it. They think about, what scale do I want this idea to enter the marketplace at? How much money would it cost to bring it out at that scale? And let me go to the capital markets and get that much money so I can do it right. Their dreams aren't limited by the amount of money in the bank account. I mean, imagine if Elon Musk, I can't remember whether he bought SpaceX or Tesla first, but let's say he bought Tesla first and he wants to start SpaceX. Well, he doesn't look at the petty cash in Tesla to go start SpaceX, right? He goes to the capital markets to do that. And so this oversight of the concept and power of capital in the nonprofit sector is a big problem, and it's driven by the fact that the sector has been so oppressed. That so many of the freedoms we give to business have been taken away from the nonprofit sector in the name of some kind of an ethic. And you know, the bottom line message of the movie and the TED Talk is, you want to know why nonprofits haven't changed the world the way we hoped that they would? Because that is not what we asked them to do. We asked them emphatically and consistently, and we still do, keep your overhead and your salaries low. So that's what they did. And if you keep your overhead and your salaries low, we will reward you with donations, regardless of the fact that you may not be having any impact in the world. And impact becomes an entirely secondary thing.
Yeah, I have stories along those lines. I have two stories I will share for fun. So check it out. I started a nonprofit, Venture for America. I donated some money of my own to start it, and then I went around and shook down some rich friends for money. A number of years later, we had some success, and it was our gala. Well, number one, I said galas are stupid. Let's skip the gala and just have everyone send money in place of the gala, and then they can have the night to themselves. And so I tried that, and it totally didn't work. That it turns out no one wanted to send money unless they could go to something, and then the gala does lubricate their purse strings in a certain way because they see all these other people and they're like, oh, this course is great, and they get the messaging, and then they end up. So number one, you needed to have the gala. Number two, at this gala, maybe my fourth year in, I'm hanging out with a venture capitalist in New York. And he said, Andrew, you are a great entrepreneur. This is a great organization. If you were a for-profit company, you'd be a unicorn by now.
Right.
He literally said,
right.
like, it was a high compliment. He was like, your nonprofit is the equivalent of $1 billion startup. But of course, it is not a $1 billion startup. It was a nonprofit with a budget of, let's call it $5 million or something along those lines. But it just gave you a sense of the different scale that he had in his mind. Is that, you know, $1 billion for-profit company equals $5 million nonprofit. And then the third story is I was getting a grant from major financial institution, and the CEO comes and gives us social entrepreneurs, frankly, a pretty bad pep talk, and then talking about that now that we have the resources, we can go out and change the world. And literally, I think my organization got $25,000 from this particular grant.
Yeah.
And so that there was something ridiculous about it. It's like, wait a minute, like, we all know you're a multi-billionaire, and this is a major financial institution, and then you give us 25K, and then it's like, and now with this incredible level of resources, like, go out and do something awesome. And it's like, shit, man, I could point to anyone in your building, and it's like $25,000 covers them for, you know, like 3 months,
Yeah.
or actually some of them probably like, you know, 2 weeks, 1 week. So that there was like this ludicrous differential when it came to what constituted a successful nonprofit versus what constituted a successful business, and the standards were so different that it felt like you said, like, oh wow, look, you're actually doing something, like, isn't that great? And then everyone acts all excited about it, but as someone who was leading the organization, I was like, look, I know I'm not actually meaningfully making progress in solving the big problem, but I'm very proud of the work I'm doing. And obviously, if you give me 25K, I'm going to be very, very thankful and be like, oh, thank you.
Yeah.
even though internally I was like, guys, you know, this isn't going to do it.
Yeah, we were, with the AIDS rides and the breast cancer 3 days, as of 2002, we were netting after all expenses, about $81 million a year. Now, if you put a multiple of 5 or 6 on that, right, you got a $500 million, $750 million company. And people would ask me, oh, that's great that you do that. Do you volunteer? Like, the misconceptions, like, no, there are 400 full-time people involved, paid employees involved in making that happen. And I think what you're talking about, you know, the $25,000 gift, is indicative of the idea of the fact that we don't consider the nonprofit sector to to have the potential to be a lead player in changing the world. We don't think that the nonprofit sector could do that. We think of it as a gesture. We think of it as something nice that people dabble in when they're retired or when they're done with their day, and it's why I challenge anyone to go back and listen to all of the presidential debates of the last 5 decades and see if you hear the nonprofit sector mentioned once as a critical element of how we solve problems for the least among us. And as it's currently constrained, it's not capable of taking on that role. But if we released it from these anachronistic constraints, and what do I mean by that? I mean, well, we don't allow nonprofits to use money to attract the absolute best people to solve problems. We don't allow nonprofits to advertise so that they can excite the general public about the work that they're doing and grow. We don't allow them to take risks when it comes to new fundraising and new ways to grow. We measure them in 12-month increments, so we don't give them any time, and we don't give them a capital market. And the for-profit sector gets all of those things. Well, if you gave all of those things to the nonprofit sector, it could address the issues with the help of business and government, but could take the lead in addressing the issues of poverty that still remain at 14% in the United States, illiteracy that's been at 14% for the last 4 decades, breast cancer, where the mortality has been hovering around 40,000 for the last 4 decades with no change. Suicide, where the mortality now approaches 40,000, up from 10 years ago. All of these problems are problems where the nonprofit sector is uniquely doing on the ground R&D that nobody else is doing to figure out what innovations might work at solving those problems, but they don't have the scale. The problems are massive in scale. Massive in scale. These are multi-billion, decabillion problems, and we want our charities to be small. And when they start to get too big, we think, oh, I'm going to give to this other charity because they're big enough. Well, not if they haven't solved the problem. They're not big enough, right?
Well, the ideal nonprofit puts itself out of business, which, as you're saying, never happens because the nonprofits aren't actually designed to hit a scale where they can solve the problem.
Yeah, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but one of the things that kills me is this notion that people say, well, we need to make our nonprofit sustainable. Nobody wants your nonprofit to be sustainable. They want you to go out of business. I had a client call me 5 years ago, say, we're celebrating our 50th anniversary as a breast cancer organization, 25th anniversary as a breast cancer organization. We want to tell people everything we're going to do in the next 25 years. I mean, do you realize how ironic that is? People don't want breast cancer to be around in another 25 years. They don't want to be celebrating anniversaries. They want these problems to be ended.
This podcast is sponsored by ExpressVPN. When you go to the bathroom, you always close the door behind you because you don't want random people seeing what you're doing. But when you go online, people sometimes can see what you're doing. I'm talking about those big tech companies and other folks who might not have your best interest at heart. That's why I use ExpressVPN, and you should too. This way, your data stays yours. It can't be sold and resold. When I use ExpressVPN, you just click one button, transports you to another server, and also give you access to fun content that might be available in another country. It's like you're a global traveler without ever leaving your home. Get an extra 3 months of ExpressVPN free by going to expressvpn.com/yang. That's expressvpn.com/yang for 3 extra months free. expressvpn.com/yang. Yeah, so I want to break down for people a little bit how the growth factors are totally different, just from my own experience. So check it out. I ran an education company, and let's say I did a really good job for you, and then you tell your friend, and then your friend's like, oh, maybe I should use this company too, and then they tell their friend. And so the better job I do, the more I grow.
Right.
In the nonprofit segment, let's say I was helping hungry people. If I help a hungry person well, Maybe they tell their friend who's also hungry who shows up, but that actually has nothing to do with my growth in terms of donations. Like you have a totally different marketplace you're dealing with
Yes.
in the form of donors as opposed to the people you provide services for. So my comparison, my joke, was that it's like running a chocolate chip cookie stand, but your customers aren't eating the cookies. Like they're not
Yeah.
allowed. And so you just build brochures being like, look how tasty my cookies are. Can't you tell how much they're enjoying them? And so there's something, like much more direct about, but this, by the way, was an education for me because I was a CEO of a small private company before I started the nonprofit. And the growing the nonprofit was a much more difficult, painstaking endeavor than growing the for-profit business.
Yeah, it's very astute, your distinction about growth. I'll do workshops with nonprofit organizations. I might have 300 people in a room on a Saturday, all board members from different organizations and staff, and consistently somebody will say we're growing by leaps and bounds. And I'll say, "Oh, that's great. So how much more money did you raise this year than last year?" "Oh, we didn't raise any more money." "Okay, well, what do you mean by growth?" "Well, we've got twice as many people who want our services for free," right? Well, that's not growth. That's a problem, right? If you've got twice as much demand, but you don't have the money to meet the demand, then that's a real problem.
Yeah, so let's say the growth factors in the nonprofit I ran would have been around. Okay, let me get more donors, and then you hustle up more donors. And by the way, we did grow in that way. I mean, I put in some money, so our budget in year one might have been 200,000, 250,
Yeah.
and then it went up to 5 million plus, and so people were like, "Wow, like this is like a real rocket ship." So the organization I started was called Venture for America. The goal was to train entrepreneurs to create companies and jobs around the country in the hope of uplifting and invigorating the economy and the culture. My thesis was that we had too many young people heading to Wall Street, consulting firms, and the
Yeah.
rest of it, law school, and that they should be building things and creating jobs. So I realized that our organization was never going to be able to create hundreds of thousands or millions of jobs in the way that I wanted to. And I ended up running for president because the trends that I was concerned about around automation and its effect on the labor market were just speeding up. So I said, "Oh snap! My awesome $5 million nonprofit's not going to be able to meaningfully stop that tide. What could stop that tide?" And it was only a different economy with the federal government, which is one reason why I'm so excited by your work, Dan, because you've documented essentially, look, the nonprofit sector is capped at a low level. I think you said it was 2% of the
GDP.
economy or so, and that's constant. Also relatively constant, the poverty level. It's like, hey, if we're making such great progress, like why have these numbers not changed meaningfully? And I concluded the only way to fix things would be to get a hold of the federal government and then remake the economy. That led to my presidential run. I dare say that you probably should have run for president at some point. I think that was even in the ambition set at some point.
It was when I was a kid. I was born on the first day of John Kennedy's presidency. So when I was 7, 8, and 9, I was surrounded by the images of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King and John Kennedy and his inspirational words. And I was watching my parents watch the Vietnam War, and I was watching the Mercury and Gemini and Apollo missions happen, and watching Neil Armstrong walk on the moon, and it made me, want to bring that Kennedy-like vision into the world. My timing was off in that I happened to be gay, and when I was 19 years old, I ran for the school board in my hometown and won, and that's when I was really realizing that I was gay, and there were no out gay politicians in 1980, none, and I began to get scared that people are going to out me, and they're going to think they're going to think I want to recruit kids to be gay, and that's why I'm on the school committee. So I better back out
That's
of this
terrible.
situation, and I moved to California and tried to get a record deal as a musician, and then that's where I ended up starting the the AIDS rides. But I remember, feeling just very estranged from my country as a gay person in 1980. Like, what do we teach kids? We teach them, find the thing you're passionate about and go do it. And so many kids can't, it's just like, I don't know what I'm passionate about. And to know what you're passionate about and say, this is the thing I want to do, and then have society say, yeah, you can't. That it was crushing, it was crushing. But you follow the yellow brick road, and you meet the times where they're at, and your life contributes in unexpected ways. And I look at it as, look, this is not the sexiest issue, getting people to think differently about charity, getting people to liberate charities, but it's the service it's the service to which I feel I have been called, because that sector needed leadership. And I think it can make, if we're successful in changing the way the culture thinks about charity, the difference that can be made there is enormous. Perhaps bigger than what you could do as president.
Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Please do hit like and subscribe, and hit that bell if you want to be notified every time a new episode drops. Probably on Mondays, but hit that bell, and thank you. No, Dan, I'm going to introduce to you, because here we're chasing a common vision. Check it out. All right, let's say that AI is going to make a bunch of jobs obsolete. It's going to come along and say, you know what? Bookkeepers, accountants, some lawyering, some coding, some consulting, some trading, like some journalism. And so that's one force. I'm going to call this the automation force. It's going to dehumanize the economy progressively. In my opinion, the current economy actually is becoming increasingly punitive and inhuman. And so people ask me, hey, what is the future of the economy? And when I was running for president, I said, just give everyone money. Universal basic income, $1,000 a month was what I was running on. But here's the true vision. And I said this in my early campaign events, Dan, and my campaign manager said, you can never say this again. It's hard enough getting people to handle the magical Asian man from the future who wants to give everyone money. But what I said was, look, our economy is going to make it so more and more of us are not competitive in terms of capital efficiency. But there are all of these goals that we should have for ourselves as a society that aren't about me outcompeting the machine or whatnot. Things around arts and creativity, or caring and nurturing, or education, health and self-development, or making someone else stronger and healthier, either physically or mentally. So what I said was, look, we're going to have to create new currencies to allow people to find structure, purpose, and fulfillment, taking these routes that may not right now have a marketplace. And the activity I used as an example was my wife as a caregiver to our son who's autistic. And then I said, what is the marketplace value of her work? And someone would say, I don't know, 0, because that's what we value caregivers at right now. And I said, well, let's imagine if I help my neighbor, or I babysit their kids, or I create a mural, or I volunteer, or I do something, like I get this currency that I can then give to you, I can give to my other neighbor, and then we can essentially create like a new, more human economy. And then we create a creativity currency that you could actually trade in for US dollars, so everyone knows it's real. And then who administers the creativity currency? Probably nonprofits, was my thought. What you'd go to nonprofits in the space and say, hey, guess what? Like, we're going to give you 1 million creativity credits, and you can do whatever you want with them to reward good things. And if you want to, you can redeem them, and there's money. So I can give you things that aren't US dollars.
Well, first of all, I would say I worry about AI. I worry about just mechanical automation even more. You know, when you look at how many fewer welds are required to build a Tesla now than were required before, when you look at the all of the robots and how few people are in a Tesla factory, when you look at you know, and I don't know what the cause and effect and the unintended consequences dynamics are, but when you look at minimum wages go up and then you see McDonald's starting to put kiosks for ordering your food, you go to Crumble Cookies and
Oh no, Dan, I've got a whole freaking deck on this stuff
yeah.
where 65% of Americans are not high school graduates. Are not college graduates. The top five occupation areas in the U.S. are administrative and clerical work, including call centers, retail and sales, food service and food prep, truck driving and transportation, and manufacturing. So that's what about half of Americans do. Average compensation about 18 bucks an hour, and each of those is going to shrink quick.
And that's without what Tesla is doing with robots and Boston Dynamic is doing with robots is we'll move boxes from here to here, right? Like just physical labor. It's terrifying. I step back and I think about the vision that Buckminster Fuller had, you know, this famous mathematician and philosopher, and he talked about, he got very specific, which is important, a world that works for everyone with no one and nothing left out. It's like when Kennedy said, I believe this nation should commit itself to the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth. Like if you weren't serious about that dream, it would never dawn on you that you got to get the guy back safely as well. But this idea of a world that works for everyone with no one and nothing left out. Okay, excluding the issues we're currently talking about, you know, the market economy seems to be able to get developed economies 90% of the way there, 87% of the way there. We got 87% of people taken care of, you know, whether it's through capital or cell phones or whatever it is. You know, we got most of the problem taken care of. Infant mortality rates are way down. Literacy rates are up in all of the developed countries. Yeah, but that 13%, that 10% that got left behind, the market economy has no answers for those people. Why?
Yeah,
Because there's nothing to monetize there, right?
yeah,
Which is what you were talking about. Like, how do you
yeah.
monetize the value of taking care of an elderly woman? How do you monetize the love someone gets out of Special Olympics? And that's where philanthropy comes in. And so, you know, you and I have talked about the idea of the need for a department of philanthropy. I think a department of philanthropy and social improvement at the level of the White House. And
Have you seen something called the Impact Genome Project? That they're trying to do something along these lines. And in the movie Uncharitable, it talks about paying people for results, where it's like, look, instead of I give you the organization the money and then you do some good work, but you may or may not solve the problem. It's like, look, in this instance, I'm just going to pay you for the good that is done. And so there,
yes, and there have
so
been
there,
things called social impact bonds that were
yeah.
popular in the UK, primarily relegated to the issue of prisons and recidivism. It can just be very difficult to develop those measures, especially when you're dealing with a long time horizon for the solving of a problem. It can be difficult. I do want to address your social credit issue and go back to something you said earlier about growth. You were talking about the growth of the problem versus the growth of the revenue, and I was as well. But what if a nonprofit is growing in the way that you want? They actually are impacting the problem, and Billy Shore talked about this in the movie. He said, you know, here's what I tell a donor. If I can get you 1% overhead, but hunger isn't being solved anywhere, or I can get you 35% overhead and hunger is being solved in 40 of the 50 states, which his organization has done, which is the better deal for you? Well, right now, the culture thinks of that 1%. That's what I want. I want 1% overhead and the problem not getting solved. So in the case of an organization like No Kid Hungry, what they struggle with is, or other organizations, we've got an overhead ratio that could make us a target for the media to attack us. and misconstrue what we're doing when in fact we're actually ending hunger. So we don't value the right things. But I think in terms of your social credit idea and my idea of a world that works for everyone with no one and nothing left out, you're going to get more and more consolidated money, right, in the hands of Elon Musk and in the hands of Jeff Bezos
Yep.
and others, and that's where philanthropy, and I would tuck your idea into that, becomes more important, and becoming scientific about philanthropy, scientific about what works, scientific about capitalizing the things that work, not just the things that pull on your heartstrings, but the things that are actually working, which is why I get apoplectic when I see these tax the rich declarations. It's so lacking in rigor. What, tax the rich and then do what with the money?
And then do what?
Yeah, you don't have a second sentence to that. Like,
We don't know.
yeah, like how about identify? Yeah, we don't know. How about identify solutions that work? And then I'm in favor of taxing the rich to fund those. If you're, as you said earlier, if you're a nonprofit and you want a $25,000 grant, you go to a foundation, you got to give them all kinds of data on how you know that this is working, everything else. But the federal government, no, just give us lots of money. We don't have any data on anything that works, but just give us the money, right? It's so lacking in rigor. It's so wasteful. It drives me insane. Big government versus small government, that's a false dichotomy. What about what's going to solve problems? It might be big government, but let's figure out what the answers are, and then have the size of government follow the methodology, you know?
How are you going to get healthier this year? One way to do so is to have healthy, chef-crafted meals delivered to your door stress-free. What the heck am I talking about? Factor. Factor's 2-minute meals are your secret weapon to a healthier, happier you. I've been eating Factor for this last number of weeks, and wow, it's been a game changer. We're talking about delicious chicken taco bowl, spicy poblano beef, and every time I'm like, ooh, this is going to be tasty, and it is. Makes you feel good. It's cost efficient. It's flexible. No prep, no mess. You can't screw it up. Just poke a couple holes in it, heat it up, and it's fresh, never frozen. I gotta say, if you try Factor, you are going to be pumped. It's gonna make you healthier, happier, more productive in the new year. Head to factormeals.com/yang50 and use code yang50 to get 50% off. That's code yang50 at factormeals.com/yang50 to get 50% off. Factor! Yeah. You just want effective systems. I mean, like
Yeah,
there are examples of things where, and I think your movie talks about it, where a lot of money might be spent on homelessness in a particular city, and yet you go and it's like, hey, homelessness actually hasn't been meaningfully impacted or improved.
right.
There are places where we're spending lots of money on education, and then it doesn't work, and then it's like, oh, let's spend more money, and there's absolutely no difference in
Absolutely.
impact. And then if you were to say,
But
hey,
if the
let's,
overhead is low and the CEO is paid a low salary, we love that organization, even though no difference is being made. That's the whole
yeah,
twisted lens through which we look at this stuff.
yeah, your vision is vital for us to get to a better place. That your insight that, look, we treat philanthropy as this kind of stepchild that we can pat on the head and just like pay lip service to, but we don't actually expect it to be competitive. We don't expect it to enlist the best people and pay them whatever the market rate is. We don't expect them to solve the problem. We expect them to keep their costs low, like regardless of what that might mean. One of the things you and I have in common is that we've both been growth operators in different contexts. And when you're a growth operator, you actually find you need awesome people,
Yeah.
and awesome people can very much be mission driven, but awesome people also need advancement, and that can include compensation advancement if they're going to stick with you past a certain number of years. Like an awesome person might show up and do something great and cool for a particular period of time, but then they'll say, okay, like I'm getting drawn to this other cool thing. Oh, and by the way, this other thing will also pay me better, and I'm getting married and I'm having kids and the rest of it. I mean, there's like an entire maturation cycle. So I would love to see you unlock the philanthropic sector so that it is able to compete on these dimensions that you listed, which are compensation, advertising, time, risk taking, and what was the fifth?
Capital.
Oh yeah, of course,
Yeah,
capital
yeah, yeah. Right,
markets.
right.
So that those, if we could do that, it would be awesome. And you're totally right that my idea for currencies to reward positive behaviors or measure progress and performance would get folded into what you imagine as like a much more robust nonprofit sector. Like what proportion of the economy? So let's say right now the nonprofit sector is 2% of the economy. What do you think the target or the goal or the potential is?
I think there are two ways we can grow the nonprofit sector. One is increasing donations, and in the TED Talk I said if we went from 2% of GDP to 3% of GDP, and that increase went disproportionately to health and human services organizations, that would be a massive transfer. Because right now, it's actually about a $1.3 trillion sector. And if you think of it as a pie, a third of it is fees for services, so nonprofit hospitals that charge you or museums that charge you a ticket. A third of it is government contracts, and a third of it is philanthropy. And philanthropy is now getting close to about $500 billion, $500 billion a year. But of that, only about 18% is health and human services, and only about 18% of philanthropy. So you're talking about, maybe 180, 90, $100 billion for health and human services. Well, that's where all the problems are. That's where all the suffering is that we want to eradicate. So if you allowed those organizations that are really doing the best work to promote themselves and bring in more donations and really grow so that they could begin to address the problem, an increase of $100 billion in donations that went directly to that sector would be transformative. But also, the consolidation of the sector is something that we need to look at. There are 1.5 million nonprofits in the United States. There are about 100 new nonprofits formed every day. We simply do not need 73,000 organizations working on breast cancer, right? We need one or two or three, the way we have Samsung and Apple. But because we've removed all financial incentive from the nonprofit sector, because money is bad in the nonprofit sector, wanting money is bad, there's no financial incentive to merge. And money is what motivates all the M&A activity in the for-profit sector. In the nonprofit sector, you just have holy points. And so if you merge, you lose your holy points, and that's the last thing you want. So, my best thinking on that is provide some kind of financial incentive. Maybe it's a tax credit, not a deduction, a credit,
Dude, the Secretary of Philanthropy, you're going to lead the giant roll up. You're going to be like, you know what? Let's see if we
Yeah,
can
like you and
find
I,
some
right?
way.
Thinking about these things and bringing imagination to the sector. Like, let's create a $1 billion a year. It's a rounding error on giving. iTunes for Charity that gives Americans a website they can go to and get up to date, really great information on the impact that every organization is making. In addition to the financial data, we don't have anything like that right now.
You know what? My bright idea, Dan, when I was running for president, I was going to give everyone 200 philanthro dollars that you can just give to any nonprofit you want any given year, use it or lose it, and it just turns everyone into a customer. And if you help them, it actually pays, and it grows the sector because it's like, who cares?
Yeah, but first we got to get people thinking right? We got to get them giving to the correct organizations. Like I would go and speak in philanthropy classes all the time, undergrad philanthropy classes, and the class had 10 grand to give away. And they'd bring me in at the end of the semester, and it would screw everything up because they realized they had been asking they were ready to give away all this money, and they had asked all the wrong questions. They had asked about overhead and about salaries. But like you and I are imaginative people, we're creative people, and that's what we need in government. Forget about all this moralizing and where do you stand on all the moral issues. Can we basically agree that we're all decent people? We just have different approaches to it. Let's give the money to the creative people, to the imaginative people. Like I look at the big foundations in America. There's $1 trillion in the corpuses of America's foundations. And you take the biggest ones, the MacArthur's and the Annie Casey's and the Fords and those, like, why don't those 10 leaders get together and say, hey, why don't we each put in $5 million this year? It is a rounding error, not even on our corpus, on our grant making. That's $50 million. And let's buy half the ads on the Super Bowl and educate the American public about the importance of the nonprofit sector in America. Let's put some of our money together and build a robust iTunes for charity. Let's do structural things that change philanthropy in the sector. That's why we need something like a Department of Philanthropy, because that imagination is just not forthcoming, and we desperately need it.
Well, if we wind up in the White House, you'll definitely be the Secretary of Philanthropy if that's the job that you want. So one of the major accomplishments of the last few years, which you were probably cheering the way I was the cutting of child poverty in half in 2021. Did you see this? Like, because one of the talking points you have is, look, guys, like we've been doing all this nonprofit stuff. And poverty is essentially constant. Nonprofits' proportion of the economy is essentially constant. Like, what are we really doing? In 2021, the government came along and gave every American family below, I think, 75K in earnings, $400 or $500 per kid per month. So if you were a poor family and had two kids, you might have gotten $12,000 that year. And that halved child poverty. It went to nutrition and education, like to the extent we could measure these things, everything got better. Domestic violence and abuse went down. It was like the greatest thing we'd done.
Yeah.
And then because of our political dysfunction, we undid it. And child poverty shot up again from 5% to 12% when the child tax credit ended in 22. And the child tax credit, when they did it, it was a government move. The annual cost was maybe $100 billion per year. And that's why they undid it, because they were like, oh, like too much spending. And Joe Manchin was like, it's bad. And then they got rid of it. Now, 120 economists signed a letter saying we should keep doing this. It's like the best thing we've ever done, the best thing we've done in a generation on poverty. And then, obviously it died. So that to me showed what can happen. It's like the government took a big swing and it actually halved child poverty. And if we kept doing it, child poverty would be lower today than it has been in generations.
It has child poverty, but it doesn't tell us a lot about the rest of the story, like what's going on with these kids' education, what's going on with these kids' health. Does it necessarily mean that they're going to lead productive lives? And I know you don't disagree with me here. This is where the nonprofit sector comes in. 2 points I want to make. Number one, you need R&D. You need research on development. Research and development on what approaches work for domestic violence, what approaches don't. What approaches work for mentoring teenage gang members, what approaches don't. Literacy, recidivism, you name it. Where is that R&D going on at the level of government? It isn't. There aren't R&D departments. There aren't skunk works for those things. The nonprofit sector is that, right? That's where data is.
We don't ask enough of the nonprofit sector. To your point, you're right. It's like we should be like, hey, all right, guys, let's like see what the best practices are in solving this very difficult problem. And then as soon as one of you is doing it, then we should like pump resources into it.
Pump resources into that, right? And I mentioned No Kid Hungry, Share Our Strength as an example. They were growing nicely. They were making grants to food banks all over the United States, and they decided growth isn't enough. We want to tackle ending child hunger in America by the year 2030. And they went about it very intelligently. They started working with states, with the governor's administrations, unlocking federal money that had been allocated for food programs that in many cases the states didn't even know they had, and working with teachers' unions who heretofore did not want to be working as babysitters in the cafeteria for kids eating their breakfasts and lunches. They solved both of those problems in many states, and statistically ended child hunger in 35 states, and they're still working on it. Now, Billy will admit, look, these kids are still food insecure. These kids are still living in poverty. They're still poor, but they're eating, and this is an example where a nonprofit led government to the solution. So I think that government shouldn't be the master of our destinies. It should be an instrument of our dreams, and nonprofits can help lead government to the places where the money is really going to make an impact. Because all government does is allocate money without really knowing, in many cases, where that money is going to be effective and where it isn't. We couldn't calculate what's been wasted, what problems could have been solved, but the money was instead wasted, on God knows what.
This podcast is sponsored by Helix Sleep. It's a new year. Time to make yourself better rested, more energized, and a great way to do that is with a Helix Sleep mattress. I took their quiz and I said, you know what? I roll around a lot. I sleep on my back. I need a lot of support. And I got matched with a Dawn Luxe mattress that has become a game changer, not just for me, but for my kids. It's their favorite mattress, even though it wasn't designed for them. Helix will now actually tailor mattresses specifically for big and tall customers and for kids. They have a 100-night trial. You can try the mattress for 3 months, send it back, and a 10 to 15-year warranty. It's the top-rated mattress by Wired and many other publications. Don't take my word for it. Try it out for yourself. Helix is offering 20% off all mattress orders and 2 free pillows for our listeners. Go to helixsleep.com/yang and use code HelixPartner20. This is their best offer yet, and it won't last long. With Helix, better sleep starts now. Well, that's what I was meant to pursue when I was running Venture for America, running a nonprofit. It's like you say, okay, I get some risk capital in from some philanthropists, and then some foundations come in and fund it. And then ideally you show results. And then if you show results, then maybe the government says, ooh, that's awesome.
Absolutely.
And then ends up funding. Like that's what you were meant to have, is this progression. But that's something of a rarity, as you and I know. It's like most nonprofits never get to a point where they're doing that sort of thing.
And they're not doing advocacy. They're not represented on Capitol Hill. So there's literally no communication link, between the nonprofit sector and certainly the federal government. And so we think government has to solve all these problems. Well, let's define solve. Finance, maybe, but solve, I don't think
that's
so.
That's where I am, man.
Right?
That's where I am. Government can finance, but not, but not solve.
And it's like, well, what, they're just groups of human beings. Government is just a group of human beings. Nonprofit is a group of human beings. Apple is a group of human beings. Tesla is a group of human beings. How come we have watched Tesla be the company that government didn't do that. Government didn't know how to make the global automobile fleet electric. Tesla did. Why do we think that people could not be as industrious in the nonprofit sector? There's no logic to that. It's irrational. There's no proof. If we unleashed it, it could begin to create the kind of society we want. Will there be equality? Will everybody have the same amount of money? No. Maybe 500 years from now, someone will figure out what the answer to that is. But right now, what we struggle is we don't want to see suffering on the streets anymore. We don't want to see people, with open wounds on the street. We don't want to see people who are mentally ill wandering the streets without clothing. We don't want to see kids who are hungry. We want to solve for that 10%, that group that Bucky Fuller said, no one and nothing left out. Let's do it. We can do it. We're capable of doing it.
Dude, unfortunately, that 10% I feel like is growing in America today. Like the people who are like the tenuousness. So here's the vision, the game plan, if you will. The government provides something of a foundational layer and then you have the nonprofit sector driving innovation and solving human developmental problems and issues. And we need to unlock the sector's ability to actually solve problems and grow. it needs to be, in my opinion, I agree with you, like meaningfully, much dramatically larger than it is today.
Yeah.
Now the economy, and this is one of the things again that drove me to run for president, which I would certainly encourage you to consider doing. The economy is $25 trillion a year now.
Yeah.
And so if you look at it in that context, you're like, holy crap. Well, it's like the biggest nonprofits operate at hundreds of millions level. I
Yeah.
mean, I don't know how many billion-dollar
Yeah,
nonprofits there are.
unless it's higher ed. But the biggest, the World Visions of the world, they do 4 billion, not 400. They do 4 billion a year. Apple does that every 60 seconds. Apple's bringing in $4 billion every day. It's closing in again on a $3 trillion market cap.
Yeah, so we have to tackle both these problems at the same time. And God love you for tackling the philanthropic sector and trying to unlock human potential, really, because I think that's what makes you tick. Is like people are capable of more, and we have to help people achieve what they're capable of.
We saw that with the AIDS rides. Like the AIDS rides were not 5 kilometer walks or runs or rides. They were 7 days, and you had to sleep in a tent for 6 nights. And we didn't recruit athletes. We recruited average people who were yearning to express. People are terrified that they're going to die and that hero or heroine in them is never going to find expression, that they're going to be buried with their potential still in them. People are tired of being asked to do the least they can possibly do. They want to be asked to do the most they could possibly do on behalf of the causes that have broken their hearts and the great issues of our time. We minimize people. Human beings have the most incredible potential, and we need to speak to that as a nation. And I think one of the ways we need to speak to that we haven't talked about is with Apollo-like goals. You know why we got to the moon in 9 years? Because John Kennedy set a 9-year deadline. You know how long it would have taken? If he didn't, we still would not be there.
Yeah, we still
right? Because deadlines drive urgent conversations. They force you to talk about things other than the weather. And in the absence of deadlines, you literally get to talk about the weather and the Patriots and the Red Sox, and I think, where is the serious deadline for the end of cancer? Where is the serious deadline for the end of homelessness in the city of San Francisco? Because if you didn't have a deadline, if your kid didn't need to be at school at 8 o'clock, what chance in hell is there that they would be ready for school at 8 o'clock, right? It's just a basic principle of living. And we do not apply it to the great social issues of our time. And I think people should study Apollo. And one of the great things about Apollo is it was unbelievably well documented. You can get a PhD in the achievement of the impossible by studying how we got to the moon in 9 years without a computer any more powerful than a calculator.
Yeah, it is wild to think about. It's true.
Yeah.
It's unlocking human potential, entrepreneurship, activism, kindness, arts, creativity. Congratulations on your work. Uncharitable, the movie, is an awesome achievement. I know that you must love seeing people watch it and then how they respond to it. How can people support you, your work, and hopefully unleashing the entire nonprofit sector to the betterment of humanity?
Right now, get people to see that movie. Get as many people as you know to see the movie. Host a viewing at your home. Host a screening in your organization. Host a screening at your company. It will be streaming January 1. Right now, it's still playing in theaters. You can go to uncharitablemovie.com, and if it's not playing in a theater near you, you can contact us, and we can help you with a theater buyout. But we didn't make the movie as something to be overstepped in the name of something bigger. We made the movie because we felt that this is the educational tool that is going to be required to change the way the culture thinks about things. And you need to change the way the culture thinks about things, right? That's what we had to do with seatbelts. It's what we had to do with smoking. I'm gay. It's what we had to do with gay marriage. You need to change at the retail level, at the grassroots community level, the way everyone thinks. And then policymakers will follow suit. And then the media will follow suit. That's why we made a movie. So the answer is go see the movie. Get as many people as you can to see the movie.
I certainly recommend Uncharitable, the movie. It's impossible not to walk away a changed person, really, because you watch this movie and you're like, oh, it makes certain things make sense to you in a way they had not before. Congratulations on that and the work that it reflects. Dan Pallotta, man, you were my hero after that TED Talk. Because imagine me as a youngish nonprofit founder and then watching that TED Talk. And you're still the same hero you always were.
Well, thanks, Andrew. And then our paths diverged, and you became this huge global figure. So good for you. I mean, the gumption that it took to say I'm going to run for president, and the success you had with creating a platform. My hat's off to you as well, man.
Well, thank you. You know, when social entrepreneurs occasionally see me, it's like, oh, like, you know, because I knew a bunch of them from the circle. I mean, you know, like
Yeah,
a bunch of us knew each other, so it made me happy because I actually think that that's my tribe.
absolutely. Yeah. Well, good. Well, I look forward to all the things we and others are going to do together to create the kind of world that we really want and really deserve.
Yeah, Uncharitable the movie is going to help speed up the path there. Congratulations, Dan.
All right, Andrew. Thanks.